Hi everyone, and welcome to TLDR Week 5, Privacy, Anonymity, and Paranoia. Now that you have been in the class for a little while, you are hopefully looking at things a little bit differently than you were before, and so it's time to start thinking about how far is too far in starting to get worried about some of the things that you're hearing about. The learning outcomes for the week is I want you to be able to discuss the difference between privacy and anonymity. I want you to be comfortable with the concepts of privacy and anonymity in terms of computer security. I want you to be able to be private and anonymous on the internet while doing basic tasks like emailing, using a web browser, or communication. I want you to be familiar with the current tracking tools and technologies and the data that they're collecting. And I want you to be able to discuss when and for who it might be appropriate to bypass some of these tracking methods. So the first thing that we have to look at is, what does your browser know about you? So for a lot of people, they might not necessarily realize it, but a browser actually collects a surprising amount of information in the background without ever checking. Now, browsers do check about some things, such as they will ask you if you would like to share your location. But there's actually quite a bit more that they don't ask you about that is being collected and stored. So, a browser and a web page, if you use your browser to go to a web page, the web languages give the developer the ability to track a surprising amount of information, including basics like, what is your IP address? But it's also able to do something called browser fingerprinting and network monitoring. Part of what a web page can do is actually the equivalent of a fingerprint. This is going to include things like your approximate location based off of your ISP or cell phone provider, the browser that you're using, including any updates and add-ons that you have installed, any things that you're logged into, like for example social media. It might have tracking cookies that it's able to check in. It might be able to do things like, are you on a phone or are you on a desktop or a laptop or something like that. And all of that information is actually enough to do what's called basically browser fingerprinting, so they can sort of narrow down who you are a little bit easier. So the last bullet point here is actually a website, webk.robinlinus.com. And what this person did is actually create a website that will illustrate to you all of the things that a browser can collect without ever checking, including, which I think is really interesting, the ability to use the accelerometers to guess if you are on a cell phone or a tablet or a laptop. And there's also a little section in there where it can scrape the metadata from pictures. So if you have a picture, there's going to be data saved about that picture. That's called metadata, and that can actually be scraped from the picture. So please take a moment to pause me here and go to that website on at least one device, probably a cell phone, but you could also do your regular computer, and start looking through to see the information being collected. Now, smartphones are going to collect quite a bit of data as well. Now, there's the general app permissions. Some changes have been made there in that a lot of the smartphones are Android or iOS, and they've both started to give some more fine-grained permissions where you can actually give specific apps specific permissions or forbid specific things. Smartphones are basically like little trackers that you carry around with you everywhere quite voluntarily. So they're able to do things like location based, which cell towers are you connected to. There's going to be some information about which cell provider you're using. There's actually something called super cookies that some of the providers had been using. And what those super cookies would do is actually have a piece of information that was sent in every single packet from your cell phone, whether you're using a VPN or Tor or anything like that. So they could actually track you outside of those things because of the way they were able to put the cookie within the packet that's being sent. Smartphones also have the ability to obviously do things like take pictures, record voices, map Wi Fi, and then all of these different pieces of equipment are going to use something called terms of service and EULAs, or end user license agreements. And what these are is basically a legalese way of being able to tell you what an app or phone or piece of hardware will and will not be doing. Now, of course, the downside to terms of service and EULAs is they're actually very long and relatively complex. So there is an art installation where somebody actually printed out the terms of service and EULAs for some of the more popular social media sites, so you can see exactly how long they are. Somebody also calculated that it would take somewhere around a year of time to thoroughly read and understand the EULAs for the general things that we use every day, like our cell phones, websites, social media, things like that. Google is the current most popular search engine, and so then the next question you have to ask is, what does Google know about you? So Google is going to obviously know the searches that you've made, if you have a Gmail, any email contents, if you do purchases or you're a part of any associations or you get any newsletters, they're going to know about that as well. Now, one of the things that actually makes this slightly more interesting, the example I always use is the doctor. So if you go to the doctor and you are diagnosed with something, the conversation that you have with the doctor is actually protected under HIPAA, which you may remember from compliance. Now, anything that goes into your medical record is also going to be a part of HIPAA, and there's going to be some very specific rules about who it's allowed to be shared with and how it's allowed to be shared. However, at this day and age, for a lot of people, they don't keep the medical conversations between them and their doctor. They ask the internet, Dr. Google. Think about how many times you've asked the internet, what is this thing that's happening to me? What is this spot on my skin? And what is this particular symptom? Now, obviously, we all know that asking Dr. Google things like this usually leads to, oh no's cancer, which is a separate issue of the usefulness of Googling it. But at the end of the day, almost everybody is going to try Googling symptoms, Googling medications, and Googling any words that the doctor has given them. So, all of those things are things that Google knows, but none of it's actually protected by HIPAA. So, it ends up being this sort of weird gray area that we're currently at. Social media has a lot of the sort of same problems. Social media tends to have applications or apps on your phone, which means those apps are going to be able to do things like check accelerometers. Are you walking, running, sitting? Locations. Where are you going? How far from home are you going? How often do you go there? And then it can actually make guesses. Where do you work? Where do you live? Stuff like that. They can also look at who you interact with. If the application has permission to say, look at your call history and text log, then they can see who you talk to, how often, and that's not even getting into what you talk about. Social media is also unfortunately well known for the knowledge based questions and answers being a problem. A lot of websites and places will do authentication based on knowledge based questions. What was your first pet? What was the name of the street that you lived on at first? All of those things are things that are actually shared on social media. Now, the graphic that I have here is the different types of social media explained with coffee. You might also see this with donuts. Facebook, I like donuts. Twitter, I'm drinking hashtag coffee and eating hashtag donuts. LinkedIn, my skills include eating donuts. Pinterest, here is a collection of pictures of donuts, recipes for donuts, and squats so that I can work off all of the donuts that I've eaten. And so you can sort of get an idea of the goal behind a lot of the different types of social media. Now, the last thing that I have in here is a TED Talk that I would like you to watch. And this TED Talk is what your likes say about you. And she actually talks about the link between liking curly fries and intelligence. It's a really interesting talk. Now, the assignment for the week is a little bit different than what you've seen before. What's going to happen is we are going to be looking at encrypted communications and threat models. I have a couple of scenarios that I'm going to present to you, and I want you to take some time to really think about the scenario that I've presented and the threat model that that includes. For example, let's stay really topical. During the summer of 2020, when this is being recorded, there's been a lot of protests happening across the United States. From an information security perspective, what does a protester need to worry about in terms of being, say, tracked after the protests? Do they need to worry about police setting up a stingray so that they can tag all of the phones during the protest? Do you need to worry about, if you are one of the organizers of the protest, people that are going to try to break into, say, your email or your personal phones? So you have to give a lot of thought to each scenario in terms of the risks that might be there, some of the spying capabilities based off of the threat that you might possess, and then what you can do about it. So if we go back to the protester model, what's a reasonable thing to do? Well, some people might say, for example, leave your phone at home. But if you leave your phone at home, how are you going to record what's happening so that there's a record in case, for example, the protests against the police are happening and they're wearing body cams but being unwilling to release the footage? Is something that you should do as a protester have a way to be able to record what's happening as well? Is this something where you would bring a cell phone, buy a separate device? What makes the most sense? So each of these scenarios is going to require a lot of thought and research, and I'm going to have the lab in Blackboard. After I get somebody besides me to proof it, I'll try to remember to add it to this YouTube video as well. If you have any questions, please let me know.